Well, here we are discussing the rise of the globalization model, the globalization idea in our time. We started out talking about globalism in world history, talked about the Anglo-globalization model for the 19th century, talked about its decline and fall, as described by Frieden in his book about the fall and rise of capitalism. So more or less following Frieden here for most of us. I think it's useful and valuable to follow Frieden on this. I don't think it's bad from the standpoint of the rise and falling action. If he's given us an explanation of the fall of capitalism, though, I don't see it. I don't see the economic causes of the fall of capitalism. Somehow it just fell in World War I. So we're left to conclude that maybe there was something more to it than the economic history. And that is more or less the way we're pursuing this entire discussion. You know, we're talking about the economic history, trying to follow economic history of capitalism and trying to see if it works in describing its variations, its rise and fall, and the various events in the history of capitalism. And I've been arguing that the economic history is not adequate to it. It might help us to give us a general outline of the matter, but we still need to do more explaining. When we get down to explaining, we end up with a political and geopolitical, I think, a geopolitical explanation of the history of capitalism in terms of what we might call the humane study of power. That is more or less the method that we're pursuing in this thing. Talking about globalization has led us to deglobalization, the idea of deglobalization now. So it's globalization up to 1914, it's deglobalization after 1914. And we talked about the era of the world wars in terms of deglobalization last time, and especially about the recovery model of the New Deal. That was particularly of interest to us, and it will continue to be. That will be more or less the perspective on the matter, some kind of variation on the New Deal and Keynesianism that will hold sway until globalization really takes over at the end of the 60s with the fall of the Bretton Woods system. So let's take it up through that today and try to generalize about the whole period of what we might call the two globalisms. I've distributed an outline that goes with this talk, and title of it is Two Globalisms, 1944 to 1963. So that's, you know, and this is a change. You know, this is not the way I usually teach the matter. Usually I take it up to 1968. I use 68 as the breaking off point, and I do that because that's the first time that gold started trading beyond $35 an ounce. It's a hint that the gold standard that underlies the Bretton Woods system is going to collapse. So 68 is in a benchmark there. Then you have all these political events of 68, the Tet Offensive, the U.S. decision to more or less try to phase its way out of the Vietnam War, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which means that a path that might have been taken with the Kennedys, I'll talk more about that as we proceed today, is not taken. So that's very important for our story. So there are lots of reasons for using 68 as the breaking off point. As a matter of fact, I announced this course in terms of treating globalization with a fairly fine granular analysis from 1968 on, but more and more I'm concluding that maybe it runs to 63, and maybe it's the assassination of John Kennedy that gives us the most important benchmark for world history in that regard. Well, I don't want to be dogmatic about the periodization. If you think some periodization is more logical than the one that we're entertaining, that I'm entertaining here, but please bring it forward, and we're interested to hear what you have to say in terms of a different interpretation. So we're reading Frieden on this. We're also reading Stone on this, and Kuznick, and their Untold History talks about the path not taken with Henry Wallace in 1944. So that's a very interesting thought, and I don't exactly follow them on this. I'll make it much more clear as we go along what I think about the thesis about Henry Wallace. I think it's a good place to start, though. It's something that needs to be discussed, but not perhaps in the sense that everything would have been different, that we would have had a complete alternative to all the developments that we saw after World War II, had Henry Wallace, rather than Harry Truman, been elected the American president. I don't think this is exactly the case. And not to dismiss their hypothesis at all, but simply to use it as a point of departure for future analysis. We can talk more about that as we go on. Perhaps prior to World War II, though, one might say there was no one capitalism. The famous book by John Strachey about the Great Depression, which he made this point with great vehemence. He said, we're in the habit of talking about capitalism or world capitalism or something like that. And he admonished his readers, and this is a book written in 1936, I believe. He admonished his readers, there was no one capitalism. He said there's a German capitalism, there's a British capitalism, there's an American capitalism, there are many capitalisms. And, this is a good point, and especially sharp for the deglobalization that we've noted for the 1930s. But suppose you did say that, you couldn't say that after World War II. You'd have to say, basically, there's one capitalism, and there's some other kind of system of globalization that has to do with the Russian Revolution and communism, the expansion of the Soviet state, its elaborate efforts at great expense to modernize in the 1930s, and finally its tremendous victory in World War II. So the United States and all the allies together, and Russia, of course, in their forefront, doing most of the fighting against the Nazi armies, has emerged on top, I should say, not only against the Nazi armies, but we have to remember they're the ones who destroyed the Japanese army in Manchuria. That was something the United States was considering taking on, and in the end took great pains. Both the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration, there's no discontinuity on that question. The United States is not going to land troops at the end of World War II, not going to land troops on the Asian mainland if it can get the Soviet Union to shift them around after having defeated Germany, to shift them around, send them out the Trans-Siberian rail line, and usher them into Manchuria and defeat the Kwantung Army at the end of the war. So we could say the Soviet victory over fascism is complete in Europe, and it's complete in Asia as well. Kind of an important point when we consider origins of the Cold War. It doesn't always get properly taken into consideration in most histories of the Cold War, but we should take note of it here. U.S. victorious on sea, of course, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Soviets victorious on land, both in Europe, and in Asia. So that is more or less the big geopolitical picture, the 2 sentences or so that we need to put at the top of the paragraph when we're discussing the development of the two capitalist, or excuse me, the two economic world models. What are they? Well, the first one, the United States, is a new deal for the world. It's a new deal for the world. It's been described at great length in Frieden in terms of a kind of, how shall we put it, a confluence between the American liberal New Deal, which is not really socialist at all, except in the sense that it uses the state for this or that, but not a fully socialist, at any rate, not a consciously socialist program being pursued in the United States, and the genuinely social democratic model that develops in Europe, and especially in Scandinavia, given its best expression in Scandinavia. And Frieden is pretty good talking about the consensus between liberalism and social democracy, and how pretty much this generally represents a certain model, certain unified model, with some variations, lots of variations, you could say, but even so, a model. And that is pretty much what we are thinking about when we think about a capitalist globalization at the end of World War II. So Frieden uses the expression two syntheses, saying that on the one side, coming from the United States and the West, generally we have the social democratic model, New Deal model, and then on the other side, coming from the Russian Revolution, we have this communist model, now a victorious communist model. So two economic systems, two geopolitical facts to take note of, and then two economic systems that we have to consider. The New Deal as a kind of a world model. Now, you could say that was already emerging in the 30s, but now, of course, it's pretty strongly argued. You know, and there are all sorts of documents. The Beveridge Report is talked about in Frieden, you know, this plan for a British welfare state, and it pretty much follows the outlines of a sort of a consensus, that model of Swedish, Rooseveltian, New Deal, social democratic welfare state, and very much welcomed in Britain with the Labour government. There are some nationalizations that took place in Britain that were denationalized when the Tories got back in power in 1951, but some of them stuck. And now, of course, nationalization is not the heart and soul of this model, but a few bits of public ownership here and there, maybe ownership of utilities or something like that. British nationalized the mines, the railroads, and quite a bit, you know. Nobody got around to nationalizing all of the financial structure. But at any rate, that's the model that we can think of, and it's kind of a world model, pretty much the one that is going to emanate from the United States for the whole period. And then there's another model that I think has to be taken into consideration. So I got my slide going here. This cartoon depicts the unity among all the fighting powers, the main ones. You don't see a French boot in there. France isn't considered important enough for the cartoonist, but China is. So the United States thinks China is going to become a great power at the end of the war. So it's Britain and the United States and the Soviet Union, of course, and China. The four policemen, Roosevelt called them, marching together. They're going to agree on the general outlines of a reconstruction of the world after the defeat of fascism. But on the Soviet side, one economist, and he's their leading economist, Yevgeny Varga is his name, E.S. Varga. I've sometimes seen it Eugen Varga, you know, because he's not Russian, he's Hungarian. He was in Béla Kun's communist government in Hungary in 1919. He's the leading Soviet economist and was in the 30s as well, and a prolific writer too. And then you can pick him up in the Institutski press, you know, the thick journals, as the Soviets call them, the Russians call them, in which he writes very learned articles about world politics, geopolitics, and really nobody competes with him in the 30s. And nobody competes with him really until 1946 when he fell. What's he saying at the end of World War II? What's he think the world's going to be like? You can sort of more or less assume that if he says it, it's pretty much Stalin's thinking, because, you know, there aren't any big economic articles written by Stalin against Varga. So that's probably what Varga, Varga is probably speaking for the Stalin regime and describing Soviet policy. He says at the end of World War II, we're going to see a fundamental reshaping of everything. And perhaps we get a hint, Varga thinks, from the Yalta Conference, in which Roosevelt more or less acted much more friendly towards Stalin, much more jolly vis-a-vis Stalin than he did toward Churchill. In fact, he took the occasion to poke fun at Churchill, make a few jokes at Churchill's expense, kidded him about John Bull and all the rest of that. And many people think this is highly disloyal and it means that Roosevelt was naive about Stalin. nonsense, nonsense. Nothing naive about this at all. Roosevelt thought it through, and he's a person who can think things through. He had decided that Churchill had met with Stalin a lot during the war, and maybe he had been speaking for the United States up to that time. You know, it couldn't be otherwise. Not accusing Churchill of anything to make this supposition, but he figured that those two had talked a lot, and Roosevelt had never been able to personally talk with Stalin. It's the first time you're going to talk with Stalin. So he wants to let him know that I'm not just a junior partner here to Winston Churchill. The United States is not a junior partner to Britain when it talks to the Soviet Union. And that was Roosevelt's way of doing it. That was the way Roosevelt did things. He did in a kind of jocular manner, using this enormous charm of his and all the rest of it. There's nothing naive about it. It's a very sophisticated, we could think, a way of sending this message. Anyhow, Varga was very impressed by this, and also by other things he knew about Roosevelt and about Churchill and about Stalin and their plans for the post-war period. And Varga came to the conclusion that the United States is probably going to be on the side of the Soviet Union against the end of the war. The main thing is what's going to happen to all the big empires of the imperial powers. That's the main thing. And the biggest empire is Britain. So in a way, Britain speaks generally for all of European imperialism. Roosevelt's given an indication, Varga said. Roosevelt's given an indication that he's going to be pretty much with the Soviet Union. So we're going to have a kind of, how to put it, kind of an alliance of an anti-imperialist character. The American democracy is going to ally in such a way that it will more or less pressure, I mean, not make war on, perish forbid, but pressure the British to make some changes in their empire, to give independence to various countries. Well, they're thinking, of course, of India. They're thinking of, you know, British are not going to come back to Hong Kong or Singapore. And they're thinking there'd be other changes. Maybe not a wholesale dismemberment of the British Empire, but one or another of the various schemes of Roosevelt that he bridged to Churchill during the war. You know, schemes for UN trusteeships in order to aid colonial possessions on their path to independence and all the rest of that. So he's not thinking of this as an imperialist war that is designed to hold on to all the colonies that the European powers have got their hands on up to this time. He's thinking of it in an American way. It's an American foreign policy very much, as opposed to a British foreign policy. Not to get on my high horse about any of this, but simply to say that the two nations have two different foreign policies evolved over a long time by now, and they're not exactly the same. So Varga took note of these things and said that Roosevelt would probably be with Stalin. So in view of that, in Europe, we Soviets ought not to press a revolution in the territories that we conquer militarily, where we defeat the Nazis. We ought not to press a revolution on these countries to make them a model of the Soviet Union, or a copy of the Soviet Union, excuse me. No, absolutely not. Slow them down. Make them use the model of the new economic policy of the 1920s, before the collectivization of agriculture. Don't collectivize agriculture. Hold the nationalizations down to a minimum, more or less like something that you might see in Western Europe. As a matter of fact, use Western Europe as a kind of calibration for what you do, we Soviets do in Eastern Europe. So they ended up with all-party coalitions. They revived the peasant parties instead of putting communists in power. And they made the communists play second fiddle to these peasant leaders who led most of the governments, although they depended entirely on the Red Army. The Red Army is the one who has wiped out the Nazi power over those countries, and the fascist regimes that they supported has wiped them out completely. And so the denazification of those defascization, if we can coin a term there, of those territories is a kind of a given in the supposition of Vargas. But we have all-party coalitions, peasant parties leading, not communist parties, NEP kinds of regimes, not dictatorship of the proletariat or anything like that. We'll call them people's democracies. He coined that phrase, people's democracies. And in the West, we won't tell the communist parties now's the time to press for revolution, et cetera, et cetera. No, no, no. Become part of governments that look rather similar. Tripartite regimes with, and bear in mind, the capitalist parties are not in great shape in Eastern Europe either. They have to be more or less reconstructed on a Christian democratic line. So these Christian forces of the right in Europe, combine with them in governments, together with socialists, tripartite regimes. You see that model in France, in Italy, you see it in Belgium, you see it even in Latin America. And so this is the strategy of the Communist Party. And it's not to make a revolution. It's quite the opposite. It's to have slow, piecemeal change. In fact, what we're going to do, we Soviets, we communists, is that after fascism is defeated, we are going to adapt the pace of change in the direction of socialism, adapt the pace of change so that we can march in step and in many ways subordinate to the social democrats in the West and the New Deal. So Frieden's model that he's talking about there, the strategy of Varga and the strategy of the Soviets between 1944 and 1947 at any rate, their strategy is to go along with that and not to make a revolution. So that's the balance in Europe, as I've just described, tripartism in the Western countries, all-party coalitions with peasant parties leading in the Eastern regimes. And then in the Far East, instead of supporting the communists in their civil war of long standing now, which has been more or less forced on them by Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, force these communists into alliance with the Kuomintang. And to that end, Stalin signed a pact with Chiang Kai-shek, with the Kuomintang. He forced the two of them to cooperate one with another. Mao didn't have much choice. He gets his weapons, remember, from the Soviet Union. So that's the strategy between 1944 and 1947. Only when that proved threadbare, that is, say, when the Cold War really set in by 1947, did they drop that line and start giving weapons, start forcing these East European regimes to put communists in power and start giving weapons to Mao Zedong in China and actually make it possible for him to make the revolution in China. So it's a big change that occurs, and you can see it very sharply in 1947. They're starting to criticize Varga by that time because it looks like that Varga line of cooperation with the West is not going to work, and the West is not going to. West never went for it. So that's the end of that. So Varga represents a real, how would you put it? If you want to think of this in terms of ideas, that's a good way to think about economic history in terms of ideas, but also when we're making our geopolitical overlay to economic history, it's not bad to give it a certain recognition of the intellectual factors, the ideas. And so what does that mean in terms of ideas? It's a kind of a democratic global anti-imperialism that Varga had in mind. It's a model for a kind of globalization, a global model for the world economy. I would say this is pretty consonant with Roosevelt's model and also consonant with the model of Harry Dexter White at the Bretton Woods conference. So there's the Europe that we're talking about with the Soviet, and of course Varga had in mind Yugoslavia as the model social democratic regime, the model people's democracy. But Yugoslavia was aiding the Greek Civil War, and Greece had been promised by Stalin during the war to the British, so he couldn't very well do anything with that. And as the Cold War started to set in, Stalin abandoned Yugoslavia, caved in to the United States, and mainly to the United States over Greece. Couldn't have Yugoslavia aiding Greece anymore when the United States was actually going to go there and fight, send people there and fight, that is to say. So Yugoslavia comes out of the bloc and ends up being Stalin expelled him from the communist, expelled Tito and the Yugoslavs from the communist movement, and they become a communist regime throughout the whole Cold War, a communist regime which is not part of the Soviet bloc. So it represents neutralism, and would love to see a big neutralist movement that could join in. It's going to get it. It's going to get that eventually, but not going to be a big factor in our discussions. We're talking about Bretton Woods. So there they are, 1944, Keynes on the right, Harry Dexter White for the United States, an employee of Henry Morgenthau at the Treasury in the United States, a very, very careful student of these things, very pro-Soviet, and very much invested in this Varga idea that we're talking about, pretty much thinking along the same terms Varga is thinking. He's going to be very disappointed with the outbreak of the heartbroken with the outbreak of the Cold War. But nevertheless, there they are at Bretton Woods. And they're not talking about that at Bretton Woods. You might say that a kind of a supposition is that the United States is pretty much going it's 1944, bear in mind. The United States is pretty much going to go along with something close to what I've just described with Varga at this time. But they do have a difference of opinion over how to set up this monetary system. Most of the economic history that we'll be studying deals with this nuanced discussion. It's a technical discussion of currencies and gold and things like that. It's of interest to us, but the broader political and geopolitical context, it seems to me, is crucial in giving it a really proper understanding. Let's look at the technical arguments between the two of them. What was Keynes proposing? Some kind of international currency. Basically, Keynes is talking about it, setting up a series of institutions. He's perfectly happy with what turned out to be the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and all the rest of those things. Those are things he naturally cottoned to. But he didn't think it could all be run by one national currency, by the dollar. He thought it was a global system. It ought to have a global currency. And this Bancor would have been a global currency. Now, a lot of people who deal with this take the view that Keynes is probably right about this. I don't think this is the case with Ben Steele. You're looking at some of Ben Steele's videos where he lays out his arguments about the relationship between White and Keynes. It doesn't concentrate on that too much, but it's something that we could take into consideration. The fact that Keynes wants an international system, I guess that makes him more of a broad globalist than Harry Dexter White, who wants a more narrow system based on the dollar, which is reflective of American national perspectives on these matters. And that's another important thing for us to take note of, that the American conceptions are very stridently, you might say, nationalistic. And I don't say that in a critical way at all. I think it's quite natural. At the end of the war, the United States should have thought of the world economy in these stridently nationalist ways. But at any rate, there's Harry Dexter White making that argument. And then Keynes's argument seems to be an internationalist argument, but really, it's a kind of a substitute for a British argument. So what you really have there is Keynes, representing the British Empire, trying to figure out some way that we can have international institutions that will not be run entirely by the Americans, because the Americans have it in mind to decolonize the entire world. And maybe this Bretton Woods is just a prong of that whole program of decolonizing the entire world, doing away with the British Empire. Keynes can't go there and negotiate the end of the British Empire. No, out of the question. He's got to really represent the British Empire, and that's what Bancor is. Keynes is a national economist. Bear in mind, he comes out of the period of deglobalization. All his schemes have to do with taking a national state and using it in a manner that cuts against the views of the international bankers and their gold standard conceptions. Keynes is an economist of national economy, you could argue up to this point. It's not exactly clear what his ideas are about the ideal international setup, and so this represents really a foray into that area of the unknown, Bancor. So a lot of people have taken the view that Bancor might have been a better idea technically. Well, all right, let's take this up in just a minute, but before we do, let's look at the broader context of the British Empire. What's at stake here, economically speaking? Well, at the end of the war, the United States is going to be, the United States has been backing up the British through the war, and it's been backing up the empire. It's allowed the British to think they're defending their empire. What are they doing in Burma, for example, other than defending British India? So the question that emerges very sharply for all the economic notables in the United States especially is, what is this? Are we going to have a U.S. playing second fiddle support back up to the British Empire in the future? No. And in fact, we see no reason, they might have said, these notable American notables, they might have said, we see no reason why the United States shouldn't, in effect, have as much influence in the British Empire as the British do, and maybe more, in view of the state of things. So there's the British Empire. And British India is still somehow intact, despite Gandhi's Quit India movement. It's still intact, and the British definitely, we can say this, definitely had hopes. Churchill certainly had hopes of holding on to India. Remember, India at this time represents not just today's India, but also Bangladesh, Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma. They're all part of India. So it's quite a prize economically, to say the least. And that maybe the Red Triangle can still hold together: Australia, South Africa, India. Maybe the British can control the Indian Ocean. Who knows, if they support the French, it might give them an opportunity as the French take back Indochina to establish themselves at Singapore and Hong Kong. And who knows what can develop from there. The U.S. view is that this area cannot be permitted in the post-war world. Here's a very nationalist view of the U.S. conception of globalization, that this area cannot be permitted to exist as a separate economic entity with a wall of protective tariffs around it, such as was laid out in the Ottawa Conference in 1932. So the U.S. can't do that. The U.S. is going to have to pry open the oyster, as they said, force the British to drop the whole empire preference scheme of protective tariffs around the British Empire. Force the British to drop that, because the British need money, and so the $5 billion loan is going to be tossed to them, and in return for that, they're going to have to drop this empire preference and open up the British Empire. So there's the essential economic conception of the Americans. The essential political conception of the Russians is that this whole area is going to be up for political rearrangement, decolonization, something like what actually did occur. That's the Soviet conception. So the U.S. is as we laid this out, the U.S. has a choice here. You can either go with the Soviets on this and accept the political transformation of the British Empire, and it goes without saying the rest of the empires as well. None of them as powerful as the British Empire. Or it can go with the British against the Soviets. If it does that, though, it's going to have to end up more or less imitating the British Empire in the 19th century and set up a ring of containment around the world island, according to the images that are presented to us by Mackinder in his geopolitical ideas about the heartland, rimlands. So that's a choice the United States is forced to make here, a choice between Britain and Moscow. They got a lot of good British advice on this. The conservatives were out of power, but they were still very, very powerful in the Foreign Office and among important individuals who the Americans had got to know, Churchill at their head. And the conservatives are very unhappy with Labor having come to power, and they want to see, more old-fashioned capitalist principles, such as we might associate with what's been called the Treasury view. Rather see them reinstated. They're not crazy about planning. They're not crazy about anything this Labor government's going to do. But they do have some influence perhaps with the United States. So they're offering very, very pointed advice and discussing among themselves alternatives for how to deal with the Americans. A very difficult thing. And you might also almost get the impression that the British at this time were worried if they didn't get the Americans on board against Russia, that they would have no future, or that they imagined that they would have no future. So this is one kind of advice, and it emphasizes trying to concentrate the minds of the Americans on, say, a country like Poland. I mean, there are some Poles living in the United States. Maybe that might be possible to do. Try to get the Americans thinking about Poland and, the Russian impositions against Poland, defending Poland against Russia, that kind of thing. Develop bad relations between the United States and the Soviet Union over European questions, so that there can be good relations between the United States and Britain over questions outside of Europe. Transform the dialogue about the decolonization of the world into a dialogue about a struggle against communism. A lot of British historians, Roger Lewis, Ronald Robinson, they make arguments like this. Of course, I see it that way, pretty much that way too. British want the Cold War, need the Cold War for the sake of an attempt at defending their, it's not even going to be successful, but an attempt at defending their empire. So they're getting that kind of advice from the British. And inside the United States, getting another kind of advice inside the Democratic Party from the Dixiecrat, or what's going to be called the Dixiecrat wing. It isn't really Dixiecrat yet until 1948, but a wing of Southern Democrats who've gone along with the New Deal. Remember, the New Deal would not be possible if Roosevelt tried to really stick up for the black people in the South and crush the whole system of Jim Crow laws and all the rest of that. He would have no political coalition. We might as well not even talk about the New Deal. So the New Deal at its base is a compromise on those issues. But after the war might be a different story. And there are other forces beside Roosevelt at work here. The CIO might engage, the trade union organization of the American big industrial unions, the auto workers and Teamsters and longshoremen and big unions like that. The CIO might make a big campaign into the South at the end of the war to try to organize the South. Remember, there's practically no strong unions in the South, union organization in the South, to organize it and to lead a political campaign for the end of Jim Crow. So that's the great fear. Operation Dixie, the CIO called it, which was supposed to start immediately on the end of the war. So a lot of these Southern Democratic, bourbon, Dixiecrat congressmen, Jim Crow's personification and leadership, were lobbying away here. And there's one of the worst of them on the left of the picture, John Rankin from Mississippi. So he represents this Jim Crow idea. And he himself was the most articulate racist who liked to use the word nigger in Congress, making speeches. He would make reference to niggers about Jews, kikes. They could call them kikes. Extraordinary person. People like that coming to the fore. And their message was anti-communism. It's the communists who want to carry out this campaign to organize the South, to crush Jim Crow. Communism is at the bottom of it. Got to stop it. Got to save Jim Crow. There's a picture of Jim Crow himself. And there's the slogan, that an end to integration is the program of the Communist Party. It is. And it represents communism. So they've got very powerful anti-communism. Some Europeans like to ask Americans, in my lifetime, I've heard this many times from Europeans, saying, gee, it's curious, why, we don't have this wild anti-communism. We have a kind of a government that didn't like communism or that opposed it politically in our country. They could be talking about France, Italy, Germany, any country in Europe. But we never had anything like, the House Un-American Activities Committee, like McCarthy and McCarthyism, like all this kind of rabid red baiting that we see in the United States. Why is this? What is there? And frequently you get elaborate sociological answers, describing some kind of mood among the American people. But I think it's the influence of Jim Crow in the South and the power of these democratic states. They elected Roosevelt. It's hard to imagine the Democrats having power without them. So there they are. So that's the kind of advice that is being given. And we all know how it all turned out. Harry Truman, after Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman went the other way. And he established the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, where maybe 10% of the American 10% of the American budget will be going to help finance the redevelopment of Europe, but what amounts to also the buying of American exports to Europe, American products to Europe. So this is very similar to the Dawes Plan, the Marshall Plan. I say very similar in that international perspective. So there will be a Marshall Plan, then a Dodge Plan with a fraction of that amount of money for Japan. That'll be much stronger after the Korean War. So that's the scheme of the international payments. That's a scheme according to which the United States is making it possible for European industry to revive, especially Germany and Japanese industry, which had been bombed to almost nothing in the war, for it to revive from the bottom up. So you got a lot of very educated people, sophisticated, skilled people who are going to work very cheap. So that has all the potential for explosive economic growth at the end of the war. It's all going to be aided by this Marshall Plan aid. They're going to get the dollars to spend in the United States, and we're going to set up an economic system. The U.S. is going to become also a country that's going to accept their exports, because the revival of their economies involves revival of their exports and the willingness of the United States to accept them. So the United States is not going to set up a tariff wall against these products. You're going to see Japanese and German and Italian and every other kind of car coming into the United States auto market and going to be sold in the United States. Something the United States did not want to happen in the 20s and 30s, but now it's going to put up with it. So this is all within the framework of helping them revive. It is not in the framework, I would say, of what you would call economic laws. No, it's a political scheme to help Germany and Japan and Europe generally to help them revive. The U.S. is going to become an import sink. U.S. is going to, in effect, make its market really the whole source of all the profits of a lot of important firms in Europe and Japan. All this for the sake of the Cold War. And all this according to the system of Bretton Woods. So the Harry Dexter White system, which is put in place, even though not the way he thought it would be, but in general, it's a gold exchange standard, as indicated by this diagram. So you can't say the dollar immediately covers, or I should say, you can't say that the United States immediately trades gold for all the hard currencies in the world. It's a gold exchange standard. So the currencies are convertible into the dollar, and the dollar is convertible into gold. So at any rate, through this step, they can get at the gold supply, and the gold supply is indicated here as $35 an ounce. That is more or less consistent, as we saw from a previous graph, more or less consistent with the gold price from 1933 on. So it's going to be the case until 1968, $35 an ounce. And an economist by the name of Robert Triffin said right away, this is all going to go sour. It's not going to work. And his trepidations about it have been called the Trifan Dilemma. Bretton Woods is beset by the Trifan Dilemma. The gold exchange standard is beset by the Trifan Dilemma. So here he puts it in very grand terms, between the tension between a national monetary policy and a global monetary system. So, you know, Keynes might have put it this way. But Triffin is stressing the idea that, well, first, there are not going to be enough dollars. It's not going to be enough gold at $35 an ounce to cover all the dollars you're going to end up in the world. You got to send dollars around the world. There's a dollar shortage. You want the Europeans, if there's going to be world trade, you want the Europeans and the Japanese to be able to buy American products. So you got to provide them with dollars. Secondly, you got to accept their exports. And so there you go. But on the other hand, you have to keep your balance of payments in good shape, because if it gets to the point where they ever make so many claims on your gold, they can more or less take all the gold out of Fort Knox. We saw how rapidly gold went in and out of the treasuries of the various countries in some of those diagrams that we presented in the 1920s. You saw how fast the French built up their gold supply. And that kind of thing can happen again. Why wouldn't it happen? If we permit Europe to revive, maybe the Europeans will turn out to be better traders in a certain sense than we. Nothing says the United States is going to keep all the gold that it has in 1945. I mean, not if it's an open and free trading system. So that's what Triffin was pointing out. This thing is liable to run into, many people feel he was quite prophetic about that. Well, all right, so the Bretton Woods system, what can we say about it in general? I mean, at first, it's designed with this kind of questionable political setting, questionable geopolitical setting. Is the United States going to hold a system together that's based on the containment of communism? And, you know, containment of communism, we could describe it at great length and talk about nuclear weapons. And, you know, this is a huge topic, and I take it up in a different kind. In my Cold War course, I would go into a completely different scheme of analysis here and present a lot of different information. But let's just look at it from the general economic outlines of the thing, or, well, let's generalize about the geopolitical aspects of it and what they mean for the economic side of the question. The Korean War is pretty much a bust. I mean, the United States didn't win in Korea. The main thing that came out of the Korean War was the United States built up Japan enormously and put up with the Japanese pre-war fascist system of political economy. So all those big industries, those Zaibatsu industries, organized pretty much the way they were under the Japanese war economy. That helps to account, partially accounts, for this very rapid, explosive, exciting growth in the Japanese economy at the end of the war. And the United States is going to act against that when we get to talking about the Plaza Accords in the 1980s. But for the moment, the United States was willing to put up with that. It is not good in a way for the United States economically, but from the standpoint of the Cold War, it will probably help that Japan gets built up more, although the Japanese can't even provide anything militarily to the effort of containing communism. So that's a problem. And the Japanese competition is going to end up being a problem for American workers, for the American economy generally. These are all problems that are going to be created out of this whole thing. But for the sake of the Cold War, for the sake of a general, you can't leave Japan adrift. So there it is. Not an economic scheme, but a political scheme, geopolitical scheme. And militarily, it isn't even successful in Korea. So he lost 60,000 men. Our nation became very divided and very, very unhappy and dissatisfied with what was going on in Korea. That didn't turn out well. And the French effort in Indochina to restore their colonial rule there with the aid of the British at the end of World War II, that's not going to work either. So the Chinese Revolution, the failure of the effort to defeat the North Koreans by the United States, failure of the French to defeat the communists in Indochina, the Indochina War. All these things look really horrible and things aren't going well. What would we say? That's during the period when Europe was consolidated and the European economic miracle was afoot. So let's see, we generalized. We said the Soviet Union was a land power with a big influence, big impact on Europe and Asia. So in Europe, it's been stymied and barriers have been put up to it. You might say that as the United States lost in Asia, it beefed up its opposition, its containment in Europe. You might say that containment was successful in Europe, but that it's failing elsewhere, failing in Asia. So that's the picture that comes forward. What does that mean? Maybe it means a non-European world has a lot more to say about things than the Europeans. Maybe we've reached a point in European history where, Eurocentrism may be no longer the mode with regard to the big picture, geopolitics and world history. Some indication of this is given right away after this string of defeats, and there are going to be more by the Bandung meeting of the non-aligned nations. So non-alignment and neutrality is proclaimed by a lot of big countries. Put them all together and they're more than half the world. So there you have India's Nehru, Ghana, former Gold Coast's Kwame Nkrumah, in the center, in the light suit, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno on his left, your right with the swagger stick, and at the end with his hands in his pockets, Tito of Yugoslavia. So it's not a gathering of non-whites against whites. Tito is there, but it is a gathering of non-aligned and anti-imperialist forces in the world. And together they do represent huge masses of people. This Bandung conference is a huge thing in the world outside of Europe. Not that much in Europe, not that much in the United States. A lot of Americans don't even know about Bandung. Ask somebody about the Bandung conference and probably won't get much. But outside of the European world, this was a huge thing. Among the intelligentsia of the area that became known as the Third World, Tiers-Monde, French started to call it in the 1960s, the Bandung Conference represents a kind of a gathering of most of the world against the Cold War. So you can't say that in terms of its globalism imposed under Cold War geopolitics, that the United States had the rest of the non-communist world with it. It didn't. It couldn't bring them along. It got defeated militarily, and moreover, you couldn't dictate to them. And so you ended up with this big bloc. And what is it exactly? It could be dominant in Africa. It might even have some influence outside of that area, maybe even in Latin America. I don't know, hard to say that, but it's a huge bloc in the world. And you could start to call it the Third World, if you will. Eventually that term's going to mean Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But you could start to say this is a world that is not really part of the Cold War. What economic system is it part of? Well, I'll answer that question in just a second. Oh, I should say before we go on, should take note of the fact that this is a organization in which the Soviets are not participating, but the Communist Chinese are. There's Zhou Enlai sitting at a table next to some of the Third World notables at the Bandung Conference. He gave a very impassioned speech in favor of opposition to the Cold War, neutralism and neutrality, neutralism and non-alignment, and all the rest of that. So that's poison to the U.S. system, which imagines that it's going to form this scheme of alliances all around the communist bloc and organize the world geopolitically that way. It's not going to work. Moreover, the Soviets immediately greeted the Bandung Conference as a big bloc of the world that made possible some kind of unity between the whole communist bloc, and the Chinese already part of this, so, but bring the Soviets in too, the whole communist bloc and this Bandung group, in order to form what Nikita Khrushchev for the Soviets, shown here on the left with Nasser, what he would call the peace bloc. So that's the first grand picture, the main desideratum of Soviet foreign policy during the post-Stalin years when they were led by Nikita Khrushchev. And what happened immediately after the Bandung Conference, the Soviets started to help Egypt, gave it bombers, gave it Czech arms, all sorts of things. The United States started investing in Egypt. There turned out to be a push and pull between the United States and the Soviets competing for the heart of the Egyptians under Nasser. And then there's some missteps and Nasser's support for a revolt in Algeria and developments of that sort, which ended up in the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, in which the United States did not support the British, the French, and the Israelis who were combining to try to throw Nasser out of power. British want to throw him out of power because they see a long-term threat to British oil interests in the Mideast. The French want to throw him out of power because he's helping out the rebels in Algeria. And the Israelis want to throw him out of power because he would like to organize the whole Arab world against Israel. And they made an attempt to overthrow him at Suez in 56, after he nationalized the Suez Canal. And the United States did not support them. So the United States is not an not a pro-colonial, not a defender of colonialism to that extent. And in fact, it ends up taking a position which is rather similar to the position of the Soviets. More than that, to put pressure on the bloc against Nasser, Britain, France, and Israel, the United States sold British currency, sterling, on international exchanges, put heat on them financially. in the course of this thing, and maybe that's what's brought them down. It's sometimes argued that that's what brought them down. So Suez is a huge defeat. And in effect, the U.S. ends up with a position that is favorable to the Bandung bloc, to Nasser at any rate, at least somewhat favorable. At least it's not going to join with the European imperialists in Israel to try to overthrow him. So, in effect, this might be called some kind of U.S. cooperation. The Soviets wanted to think of it that way. If it is, I mean, if there is something to what the Soviets were thinking then, we might look back to 1944 and say, maybe this is Varga's idea, that the Americans and the Soviets would make common cause against European imperialism. Maybe. Well, at any rate, the defeat of the British and the French have enormous holdings, as indicated by this map of Africa. So European imperialists still have huge holdings all over Africa, and they are even imagining they're going to be able to hang on to them. But after the Suez affair, when the United States pulled the rug out from under the European powers, there's a total jailbreak, and they all get their independence within a few years. So all these countries you see in Africa, just about all of Africa, gets its independence. Moreover, there are repercussions that spread out of this. It's the rise of the third world. It's Africa in revolt against European imperialism. And here's Martin Luther King talking with Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, two people who thought pretty much as one about these general affairs, about the rise of the non-European world and the rise to independence. Martin Luther King thought the rising of the American black people against Jim Crow in the South was the American version, an American wing of this world movement all over the globe. This jailbreak, I'd like to call it, against European imperialism. With that kind of geopolitical framework, what's the plan of this globalism of the United States to fight against the Soviet Union and to fight against communism, to fight against the other globalist model? It's pretty much import substitution, industrialization. This is not a globalization scheme according to a world division of labor of a Ricardian type, quite the reverse. Well, Prebisch says that we have to protect our infant industries. He makes arguments that sound like Alexander Hamilton's. And as a matter of fact, it has been said often, and I think correctly, and Frieden says this, that the import substitution model, such as Prebisch and his associates developed, whereby a country builds up its infant industries with tariff protection and state intervention, that this is an imitation of the schemes for development that the United States and Germany were pursuing in the 19th century. Perfectly right. Perfectly correct. So import substitution industrialization might be even a generalized term for this whole scheme of Hamilton, List, and the other national economists of the 19th century. And it develops into a kind of modernization theory, trying to marshal economic forces in the anti-communist cause. And that's done perhaps more than any other theorist by W.W. Rostow, Walt Whitman Rostow, leading economist from MIT, who wrote a lot of books on this topic, on the world economy, and is pretty much thinking in terms of modernizing the whole world economy, and according to import substitution, perfectly okay with him. He wants to industrialize most of the countries of the world. His famous book, Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto, its subtitle. It's a scheme to mobilize the world economy against communism, to make it immune to communism. So very briefly, this is what the book argues. There are 5 stages of development. So this is a traditional society. That's what we start with. Then there's the preconditions period. Let's see, preconditions period for Europe. That would have been a big, long period of the enclosure movement in England, and all sorts of world developments that made possible the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century. Then there is the 3rd stage, the takeoff. Takeoff is the Industrial Revolution. So Britain took off in the 1790s. United States took off in the 1860s. France and Germany a little bit after that. Italy and Russia a whole generation later in the 1890s. But that's the takeoff, the Industrial Revolution, you could say, the industrialization of the country. Then there's the drive to maturity. A takeoff may start with rails and textiles in England, but it branches off into other commodities. And when the economy shows that ability, we say we're driving to maturity. And then, of course, the thing we're all aiming for, high mass consumption. There we have modernization theory. This is a scheme for everybody. It's an abstract scheme that can be applied just about anywhere, all over the earth. What's he thinking about here? Is he trying to make out that every country in the world is going to end up industrializing and going to have at least a balance between agriculture and industry that's maybe comparable to, say, at least France? What? I mean, this is quite an ambition. If it didn't have the anti-communist banner under which to march, it would have been very hard to make this argument on strictly market principles, market ideas, and the rest of that. Although it's very capitalist, very anti-communist, but it's also kind of depending on import substitution and other national economy tropes, ways of looking at the world. And basically the argument is that the communist idea can only appear during the preconditions period. That's the 2nd period here, shown in green. The preconditions period. So if we can get everybody past the preconditions period, we don't have to worry about communism anymore. And I'm vulgarizing poor old W.W. Rostow here, but that's pretty much what he lays out in this book. There's only one diagram or graph in the whole book at the very end, just one. And what do you think it is? It's a model of auto sales. So he's talking about how to build an auto society. Privately owned vehicles run by gas, petroleum products. That's the world economy. And everybody's going to industrialize. This is a big picture. And that's the world we're going to end up with. That's the whole problem today. But it didn't seem so in those days. Meanwhile, there's the question of whether the socialisms in the world, we think of it that way, whether they can actually combine and create some kind of new scheme of a globalized world on a basis of national economy, Hamiltonian model, you might say. That's an interesting question. In fact, we have some suggestion that it isn't possible in the differences between the communist economies and communist regimes, especially between Russia and China. We do have some indication of that. But as a matter of fact, whether they can cooperate or not, they're certainly moving forward. They create a revolution. They bring a revolution under their wing in Cuba by 1961. They do pretty well throwing the United States out of Vietnam. They're eventually going to throw it out completely, just as they did the French. You're going to have a communist regime in Vietnam as well. And as a bloc, I don't know, as a phenomenon, world communism seems tremendous during this period, infinitely more dynamic than anything else politically. But does it have an inner cohesion? Is there a basis for an inner logic for an inner cohesion? That we can wonder about. And there's the question of how about the leading countries, the Chinese and the Russians? Who's the greater revolutionary, Khrushchev or Mao? And that question emerges very sharply at the end of the 50s, especially when the Russians decide that they don't want to give the Chinese nuclear weapons any more help with nuclear weapons for fear that the United States is going to give nuclear weapons to Germany. And so the Chinese and the Russians are going to part paths. That's the main issue that separated them at that time, nuclear weapons. But as a group of economies, so there's going to be a quarrel, as this cartoon indicates, between the two countries. So there's going to be a quarrel between various participants in this bloc on the globalist model, and maybe I don't have much of an argument saying it's a real international model in view of this tension within the bloc, but you can't say that it's any worse than the tension that's developing, and I'll continue with this point, within the other globalism. So if the title of this thing is Two Globalisms, I think we have to conclude at the end of our discussion that they're both quite divided and quite riven with serious differences. You might say that as globalization models, they are highly questionable, both of them, by 1963. And why do I use 1963? Well, the assassination of Jack Kennedy. Because Jack Kennedy emerged by 1962, October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as not just an opponent of the communist world, but as its conqueror. So he had forced Nikita Khrushchev to take his missiles out of Cuba, missiles that Khrushchev was going to attempt to defend Cuba with. I won't go into all the bargain here. That's a very complicated issue politically and diplomatically. But I think the main point is that the Soviets realized that as revolutionary as they would want to be, and as much as they would like to use nuclear weapons, employ them somehow, as the capitalists had been doing up to this time in order to advance their own cause, and that this was not going to work out because it's too dangerous. And at the end of it, both these two leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, who started out nose to nose on this thing, they ended up very much chastened by the experience and very much seeing the advantages of cooperation, at the very least, to prevent a nuclear war, which might make all our discussions of economics, geopolitics, and everything else we've been discussing, might make it all ridiculous. That's the main question, sine qua non. You've got to prevent a nuclear war, no matter how bitter your opposition between these two systems. So Jack Kennedy represents that on the American side, and Khrushchev on the Soviet side. So Soviets got rid of Khrushchev at the end of 1964. I'll talk more about the leadership that succeeded them, especially with regard to the activities of the economic bloc, Comecon. But Jack Kennedy represented what you might call a war capitalism, following some of the writers who've been using this phrase lately. Sven Beckert is one of them. War capitalism, And usually the argument is employed to suggest that capitalism came into being, through a series of wars and very violent actions. It's true, history's full of these things. And that there's such a thing as war capitalism, but there's also such a thing as war communism. The communist regime's greatest successes have been when it's waging war. It might be that communism is weaker when it's peaceful, weaker. That once its population starts to think about things, it thinks about transforming the system. We're going to ask those questions about the Gorbachev regime when we get to talking about that. But at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, after Kennedy's great victory there, he appeared to the rest of the world to have solved all these problems that we're talking about that have to do with the Cold War, although it's not a strident and triumphalist view that he presents at the end of his life between the victory in October 1962 and his assassination on the 22nd of November 1963. During that period, he's seen in the rest of the world, as you can see from this diagram, and look at all the people that the cartoonist puts at the feet of JFK. There's de Gaulle, and there's Mao Zedong, there's Castro, Tito, Ben Gurion, Nasser, every kind of politician of every stripe all over the world. They all have the feeling that somehow the United States has the synthesis, and it's a synthesis which might be called détente, détente between the two worlds, condominium, living together between the two worlds, and this last idea, convergence, which came forward in the 1960s. I'll talk a little more about it on another occasion. The notion that the differences in the world sociologically are not very great. Every country, you've got industrial workers, peasants, business owners, intelligentsia. It's the same model. They have different ideologies, different combinations, different power relations among those classes. But on the whole, those are the same elements that create a modern industrial society. So in a way, if there's no war, they should converge through common contact, a convergence between the two worlds. And that's more or less what's laid out. So it would have been Kennedy and Khrushchev laying this out had Kennedy lived, and had Khrushchev been permitted to stay in power. But neither one of them. They're both removed by their national associates. And we didn't go down that route. So the story of the two globalisms in the Cold War is a story of developing this trend, this logic toward détente, condominium, convergence between the two systems. And it's a logic that was derailed and sent down an entirely different track after the assassination of John Kennedy. So the next thing we have to do is to talk about that different track, because that's the track that leads to the globalization model. So that's something that we'll be taking up next time.